screen, double checking. Yeah, all good. Thank you so much for such a sweet introduction. That felt so like awesome to hear myself described in these like beautiful ways. Thank you so much. And I'm actually hiding my self view so that I don't stare at it the entire time the way that I might tend to otherwise. I'm also setting up a timer in front of myself because for me as an autistic person, one of my things is that it can be hard for me to keep track of the passage of time. I find it kind of slippery. And so having something down here that tells me that that already took 15 seconds is very helpful. So without further ado, to introduce myself, I'm Finnigan. My name is legally all lowercase letters because that's something you can do, which I took advantage of. And as you heard in Kate's description of me, my preferred pronouns are Z and here. So Z went to the store, I went with here, but he, him is also completely acceptable and accurate when talking about me in third person. I identify as neuroqueer. And what neuroqueer means to me is that my neurodivergence, being autistic and being ADHD, and my queer identities, being trans and being gay, they're interrelated and intertwined in a way that just identifying as neurodivergent and queer doesn't really capture the intersection of. We'll be going more into that and some more definitions a little bit later in today's talk, but I also wanted to foreground that my background is in queer interfaith work. So as a queer person and as a convert to Judaism, I've actually gone through a couple of different like journeys as far as self-acceptance goes and finding community in identities that are stigmatized. And this is kind of a theme that underlies the rest of the presentation, as well as communicating across differences. In interfaith work, I'm often facilitating conversations between folks whose views are maybe even diametrically opposed, that their convictions are so strong that they don't mesh well, but there are still going to be ways to find ways to communicate with each other effectively, mindfully, compassionately, and to great effect. I think that's the same thing as effectively, but I've also included a little note about some of my favorite topics to talk about in addition to autism and talent acquisition, just in case you want to ask me any questions about them. As you heard, I currently work with Spectrum Scholars. My last day with Spectrum Scholars will be next Friday, which feels bittersweet. I'm looking forward to the next opportunity. You'll hear about that, but I do want to say that I'm grateful to my current coworkers and colleagues who have come out to this keynote to listen to me deliver it. It's been such a pleasure to see you guys in the sidebar and in the chat. Thank you so much. And I really cherish that with quite a few of you, notable exception of new hires since last summer, Spectrum Scholars got together for an offsite and we coined our vision statement, which I love, and I'm sharing here. Spectrum Scholars is a college to career initiative at UD that empowers autistic people and our communities on campus and in the workplace through collaboration, advocacy, research, education, and service. And of course, I can't mention Spectrum Scholars without a massive thank you to JPMorgan Chase and their Autism at Work program, who is very generously funding our work at this time. In my work at Spectrum Scholars, I am able to do all sorts of really satisfying tasks, scheduling, doing admissions, hiring new employees, staffing our volunteer initiatives, and I've even created an internship for a member of our sister program, Career and Life Studies Certificate. And in February, I'll be moving to a new position with Sound Agriculture. They are an ag tech, biotech, plant science startup based in California. I will be fully remote as a talent acquisition associate, and I'm looking forward to bringing in new skills and building on previous skills in order to really advance what I see in Sound Ag as a commitment to DEI work. And I really do see DEI work as being where neurodiversity work belongs. And I'm going to get into that right after I define some terms. Smiling that we just hit the 100 participants mark. I really love nice round numbers, so I'm pleased that we got there. So in order to set the stage for today's keynote, I do want to define neurodiversity as opposed to some other terms that I will also be using. So diversity is a characteristic of a group. So this call is a neurodiverse Zoom call. We've got people who've got various different neurocognitive styles, neurocognitive abilities. So this group is neurodiverse. Whereas individuals, for the most part, aren't diverse because diversity is a quality of a group. So individuals usually diverge. So an individual is neurodivergent, like myself, but a group like this call is neurodiverse. In addition, as I previewed earlier, the combination of neurodivergence and queerness can often combine to a sum greater than the total of its parts. For example, the ways that I communicate with people, I've learned them through mimicry, through like actual like study of interpersonal communication. I really love linguistics, so I love thinking about like the aspects of language and language use that convey meaning. And people who aren't neurodivergent in the same ways that I am use language really differently. And so to communicate effectively with those other people, I've taken it upon myself to learn their language, to become fluent in neurotypical. And in doing so, I realized that there are so many aspects of communication that are gendered or that have to do with group identity. So keeping track of time, I will note that I often choose to employ different presentation techniques depending on my audience. And I don't mean that as like a formal presentation. I mean that as like how I use my voice. If I'm like talking to my friends, I might use more of uptalk and I might use more like filler words to be more like approachable and like we can get along better. And so like that's the kind of communication style that I would use more with like my coworkers, and it's like more feminine. It's also more gay, which I like because I am. And if I'm, you know, looking to tap into like a powerful like presence, I might start dropping out those filler words like and I might switch to using a tone of voice where instead of going up at the end of my sentences, my pitch falls down over the course of them. This is a slightly more masculine way of talking, and it is often very effective when I am trying to convince people or persuade people of certain things on a like, power level, as opposed to a more like collaborative level where I'm inviting people to come and join me. Just, I could go on about that for a while. And I really foreground this identity of neuroqueer because I feel like the stigmas that I face as a queer person and as an autistic person are very, very, very similar in their qualities. I've laid out 4 qualities here, such as identity. So being autistic and being trans, these are, you know, states of being, these are descriptions of me, and both homosexuality and gender identity disorder used to be in the diagnostic manual, the DSM. Homosexuality was removed in 1973 and gender identity disorder was removed in 2013. In both cases, this pathologization, this saying it's a disorder about a natural variation, in this case, a variation in sexual orientation or gender identity, was pathologized and then later that was recanted. Autism was only added to the DSM in 1980. So I don't know that we've yet had the time to reconsider and potentially recant what it means to pathologize a natural variation, in this case, in neurocognitive functioning. And being labeled as autistic allows me to take pride, but I'll get to that point in a moment. Because another aspect of both autism and queerness is that to varying degrees, this can be concealable. The characteristics that out us or our choice to disclose to people can sometimes be, like I said, a choice. There are folks for whom transness or neurodivergence is very visible. They have no option but to be seen as that, which I think is even more reason for me personally to not conceal, such that I am also a target, and so that hopefully I can take some of the heat that somebody who doesn't have that choice might otherwise be receiving. Additionally, it's not like being in the closet's fun. So I would just like to put that out there. And we often choose to keep ourselves hidden away because of the stigma that society puts on us. As minorities, the majority group has a bias for their own group, which, like, you know, that's fine and normal. I'm biased towards my own groups as well. But when the majority is biased towards itself, it leads to the oppression of the minorities, which is obviously inappropriate, and we should do something different about it. Which leads me to my point about pride. I think that one of the greatest ways to combat stigma is to be loud and proud, and to demonstrate that we are not good despite being queer. We are not good despite being neurodivergent, but in fact, we are good because of these identities which we hold. Being stigmatized is not a reflection of our worth. It is a reflection of how we are valued. And those are crucially different. All of us have unique attributes of strengths and challenges. People who fall into a certain diagnostic or even identity label probably share more characteristics with each other than they do share characteristics with people outside of the group, but we still are massively diverse. And I think that the real underpinnings for me of promoting neurodivergent talent being championed in the workplace. ADHD honesty moment. I have no idea how I started that sentence, so I don't know how to finish it. I'm gonna just start over. Even though ADHD interrupts me in the middle of my sentences, it also makes me able to jump quickly from topic to topic to topic and see connections between them in ways that my colleagues might not. And so when I'm able to bring that to the table because I'm celebrated and accepted, then we are using an amazing feature of talent strategy. When employees can bring their entire selves to your organization, starting from the moment that they read your job description, all the way through their exit interview, when you're able to show employees that their entire self is valued in the workplace and on your organization's team, then you're going to be inviting people to bring all of their best to their work. And it's not just the people that need to bring it all, it's the organizations. Organizations need to buy in across their teams. People ops, talent acquisition, if that's separate, management. I could name others, but I am focused on the time. Like, you really, it can't be something that's siloed. And it's certainly not the responsibility of a single DEI leader. This is something that needs to be incorporated into the conversations of every team using relevant data. Analyze the metrics of things like your hiring process. See where in your hiring processes people are facing challenges. Are they not submitting the application because they got to the part where there's a document upload and they just close the page? Are talented individuals coming to your interviews with the skills they need to do the job, but not necessarily having the charisma to wow an interviewer? Are they being looked over because their job skills aren't interviewing skills? Questions like these are what lead, I want a different word than lead. That's fine. ADHD. By using data to figure out where our weak spots are and figuring out where we might want to put more attention, we can leverage an incredible amount of impact for diversity, equity, and inclusion across the life cycle. And the ways that we can do this, I know you're going to hear an incredible amount of actionable steps and more from the things that are happening after this keynote. But in terms of destigmatizing autism and autistic people, the first place to start is with open-mindedness. In my communication style today, I'm being rather still. I'm performing eye contact with my web camera. But like, this is probably how I actually feel. But it's, for one, it's kind of hard to talk through all that. And two, like, if people don't know me well, they see me doing that and it causes them to feel a certain kind of way about me if they're not familiar with me. I'd like to avoid that. So it's an example of something that I conceal in certain environments. But to really bring my whole self to a workplace, like at Spectrum Scholars, I need to know that the people I'm working with are going to see me flapping and humming and being weird. And it's not going to change their opinion of me as a talented professional. Because the things that you see me doing are they're emotional regulation. I'm flapping and rocking and humming and making faces because it helps me calm down or express joy or process frustration. And if seeing me emotionally regulate brings up a need to emotionally regulate yourself, I invite you to do so. Like, if you ever want to join in with me, like try out rocking, I mean, feel free. But also pay attention to how you feel when you are around folks who are stigmatized in society. Do you feel uncomfortable? If you do, that's okay. That's understandable. The goal is not to prevent yourself from having these feelings, but to respond to these feelings with compassion. And you can respond to yourself with compassion, and you can respond to your neurodivergent colleagues with compassion. You can advocate for policies at your organization that reduce discrimination. I know one of the questions is about this, so I'm not going to give it away, but doing things in the hiring process or doing things in the like performance review process, there are all sorts of ways that you can become more neuro-inclusive. And again, you'll hear great information about this later. On the screen is a fantastic post by an Indigenous autistic mother. You can find her on Twitter at autistic typing. She's also on Facebook, excuse me. But I love this. Sometimes the transition to doing the hard thing is more difficult than doing the hard thing. The procrastination or the avoidance or the difficult concept or not knowing how to proceed, sometimes that's what stops us as neurodivergent people rather than the thing itself. A technique that I've used with my current supervisor a lot is called body doubling. There are some tasks at work that I struggle to get around to, but if my coworker or my supervisor just sits with me and he's answering emails and I'm doing the thing I really don't want to do, okay, all of a sudden it's done. I didn't need to be berated for struggling about, my time management, yes, it's related to my neurodivergence, but the support can come in a variety of forms. My 20-minute timer just went off, and this is my, I think, final slide before Q&A. And I just want to end on this concept that causing people to feel shame, such as around struggling to do a basic task, causing people to feel shame doesn't enable us to do better. Studies have actually shown that shame inhibits the parts of our minds that are creative and problem solving and look to grow. But when we approach our feelings of shame, whether that's shame about ourselves or judgment of other people, when we approach those negative feelings with self-compassion, we can transform them and we can grow. So I'm like really impressed with myself that I managed to do that in pretty exactly 20 minutes.
That is awesome. Thank you, Finnigan, for sharing all of those thoughts and wonderfully timed. We'll now move on to some Q&A. So you can submit through the link. Maybe we can drop it in there again, but I'll start off with the first question. One of the things you talked about was this talent experience. And one thing we often hear about the interview process. So what can somebody do to ensure that the interview process is accessible for everyone, including neurodivergent talent?
I love this question. So I'm actually pulling up, in order to answer your question, I am popping into the chat an example that I came across organically. This is an example from Ultranauts. A friend of mine is applying for a position with them. I found the position and sent it to my friend, but they've got this amazing, beautifully long Google Doc that lays out all of these elements of their recruitment process. And it just strikes me as an amazing example of something that's incredibly, specifically autistic friendly, but also accessible for other neurodivergences as well. As an autistic person, when I'm interested in, say, a program at a school, I'm going to go to the school website, find the program website, read everything and all their outdated FAQs, and then any like interviews with the staff that I can find, because my approach is about gathering as much information as I can and then systemizing it. So seeing something from Ultranauts that lays out all of the information about their interview process and explicitly lays out, for example, non-speaking interview practices as something that is accessible to any applicant who requests it without requiring disclosure. They lay out that they view candidates equally whether or not they disclose neurodivergence, and suspected neurodivergence is not going to be something that affects your application. I'll let us move to the next question, but like I really, I'm thrilled with the specificity and the in-depth nature of that document that I shared.
That's great. I just got this question from the Q&A, and I think it goes really nicely with what you just said. So I'm going to ask this one. It says, what advice would you have for a job seeker when they see the question about disability on an application? Should they disclose?
This is a great question. My gut response is like, it's up to you, which is not very helpful. My strategic response is like, is your approach personally one where you're willing to be in a place of like advocating for your needs if the employer is one that isn't already at a place of acceptance? Like, are you willing to put in the effort to be there first if necessary? So that's something to think about, but not necessarily like how to answer. In terms of how to answer, if you decide that you want to disclose, personally, I basically always disclose because I don't want to be somebody's first. I want an employer to understand that they're getting me and everything that that entails, and I want them to still pick me. And the way that I frame that is similar to how I framed it in this presentation. When I disclose, I explicitly disclose in a way that highlights my strengths. I say things like, as an autistic professional, my strengths are in systematizing knowledge and taking a lot of information, turning it into something digestible and delivering it. Those are my strengths, and I have them because of my diagnosis, which also means I'm going to need these accommodations, which I think you'll want to make for me because I'm an awesome employee. That kind of approach, it's apparently good to brag some in your like job search as well. This is a skill that I did not know as a young autistic person, especially as one who was perceived as a girl until my early adulthood. I was taught to kind of not take up a lot of space, not talk about my accomplishments, not make myself sound impressive. But for job interviews and job searches, take a look at the things that you do well, find the ways that they connect to your neurodivergence, and find ways, if you choose to disclose, of sharing your diagnosis or your neurodivergence in a way that highlights your strengths to the employer and the role that you're applying for.
That is great. So we are getting many questions. I'm going to hope to maybe get some of these answered after, but I think this is an interesting one that came through that asks, where does ADHD fall in neurodivergence, and where can I find resources to help educate corporate America?
Ooh, okay. So neurodivergence, as opposed to neurodiversity, which was coined by Judy Singer in the 90s, neurodiversity originally was like kind of focused on autism, and then also had this flavor of like biodiversity, so like the natural variation of humanity. Whereas neurodivergence, Kassiane Asasimasu coined that term to encompass any divergence from normative standards. So even mental illness or traumatic brain injuries, anything that causes a divergence can be considered neurodivergent. So in that sense, ADHD is completely neurodivergent. Your brain is different from the cognitive standard, the ideal. And in terms of corporate America, I don't know that I have any specific resources. I've mostly been in higher ed till now, but something that I would say is if you were to like Google successful ADHD people and then sort of look at their, sort of look at who those people are, you might start to draw some themes. Like ADHD people are often very gregarious. We're often very energetic. We're often very charismatic. Not always, but you know, some of us make great salespeople. Others of us thrive in different roles. My approach is usually immersing myself in knowledge and pulling insights back out. So maybe try that approach. Oh, and if I, you know, can get back to the Zoom screen for a second. If I, oh, I think I closed it. Okay, I will put my contact info in the chat because I meant to share that as a slide.
Perfect.
So feel
That
free
would
to
be
reach out
great.
to me personally as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Finnigan, for all of your insight here. And like I said, I hope that we can get some answers to these questions for you. We will follow up in an email. And Finnigan is awesome on LinkedIn as well, as some people have pointed out in the chat. So feel free to connect there and learn more.